Hi, my name's Zach Varda, and this week on the Student Slant, we talked to Phil Mattingly, CNN correspondent and Ohio State alum, about covering the 2016 election, the current landscape of journalism, and his path to CNN.
So I didn't necessarily take the most traditional path from Ohio State to CNN, if there is such a thing as a traditional path. I wasn't a journalism major at Ohio State. I played a sport at Ohio State, not very successfully, and only wrote my last semester for the Lantern. Did grad school because it was the only way I could possibly get a job, and then basically just plugged away, begged for jobs every place that I possibly could, and lucked out in getting stuck in Washington, D.C., and on a beat covering banking finance stuff in the middle of the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression. And while it was really, really bad for the world and specifically the country, it ended up being great career-wise for me. So basically what I did is I did small Capitol Hill publication to a little bit bigger financial news wire known as Bloomberg News, covering banking, finance, econ stuff. Moved over from print to television while I was at Bloomberg. Bloomberg's got a business TV station, kind of like CNBC. Covered the White House for Bloomberg the last couple of years for the Obama administration. And then CNN called, and I was lucky enough to hop onto the craziest campaign that anybody could ever imagine, covering Republicans throughout 2016. Left my poor wife and our young son and very large Great Dane at home for 11 months by themselves as I traveled the country with Chris Christie, John Kasich, and Donald Trump, then candidate Donald Trump, and who, as we all know, became President Donald Trump, at which point I stayed in New York, covered his whole transition, even was there when Kanye West randomly stopped by for some bizarre reason that none of us can figure out yet. And then once that was done, came back to Washington, D.C., and now cover Capitol Hill. So my day-to-day for CNN is if there's something moving policy-wise on the Hill, whether it's healthcare or taxes, immigration, or 280 characters from the president at 6 in the morning, that's what I'm going after, and that's my day-to-day. I'm Phil Mattingly.
Zach Varda.
I'm Jake Ray, and this is the Student Slant. You mentioned in class that you went to a lot of different things. You went from a small newspaper in Ohio to now at CNN. What is it like now compared to what it was like before in journalism, in your view?
It's a tough comparison in the sense of, when I was at the Lima News, which is a great newspaper in Lima, Ohio, it was print, it was small town. CNN obviously is kind of big national and obviously TV driven, although I do a lot of writing. I think the biggest thing for me is that the journalism doesn't change, right? Like it's the same nuts and bolts reporting, calling people, getting your facts straight, making sure your sourcing is right. And then once it's good and once it all checks out, putting it out there, whether it's in a digital platform, whether it's in a print newspaper, or whether it's on air on a 90-second bite, that all stays consistent. I think the biggest difference right now, to some degree, is the stakes. When you mess up on a national level, you're going to get hit, and you're going to get hit hard, and likely you're going to get hit from the Oval Office, and that's a little bit different maybe than when I screwed up a couple times at the Lima News. But overall, I think almost the good part about it is, if anything's consistent, it's the journalism's the same.
Yeah, you mentioned getting hit from the Oval Office if you mess up. There's a lot going on with journalism nowadays, and the government, they kind of seem to be at odds. What is that like as a journalist at the place where our president is kind of targeting as the fake news CNN?
Yeah, it's different. Look, I covered the Obama administration, or I covered the Obama White House, and I don't think at that time we ever could have imagined a situation like this. I will say that having covered the Trump campaign, I think I'm more used to it, I guess. You kind of recognize that to some degree it's a shtick, to some degree it's a play. It's kind of what they do strategically. But I also think it just underscores the importance of getting it right every time, right? That you can get pulled into the fight and you can get pulled into the tit for tat or the mano a mano. That's not how I view my job. My job is to report what's actually happening and make sure our viewers are aware, or the people who are reading CNN.com are aware of what's actually happening. And don't give them, what we were talking about during class, like don't give them an opening, right? Like you should always strive to get everything right when you're a reporter. You should never go off with something unsure or something that you're not totally sure about the sourcing. But now more than ever, you just can't screw up. You can't give them an opportunity to attack you or to tear apart one of your pieces. And I think, frankly, for some of us, maybe a lot of us, that sharpens what we're doing. It sharpens the rationale for why we go to work every day, but it also sharpens our stories to make sure that, you make that extra call. So it takes another 10 minutes to get your story out. So maybe you don't break it or you're not first, but at least your story's right and you're not putting something out that's breaking that ends up getting you lit up frankly, for a right reason. Like if you're putting stuff out that's wrong, if you're putting stuff out that's not full, and then it's not adequately sourced, like you should get hit. Maybe not to the degree we're getting hit right now,
Yeah.
but like that's the deal. We signed up to get stuff right, and I think that's probably the biggest thing right now.
Yeah, and under all this immense pressure, as a reporter in this environment, how do you keep readers happy? And how do you keep yourself happy as a reporter? It always being criticized and always having to be right. That's a lot of pressure to take on.
Yeah, I mean, look, the job's not to keep readers happy, right? The job's to tell them what's going on. No matter what you do, there's always going to be complaints. Like you go on Twitter and follow kind of the mentions that we get on a regular basis. It's it's pretty. My direct messages are open. You should see those sometimes. Those are pretty great. So that's not really the focus in terms of a lifestyle. Like the beauty of it is like this is what we signed up to do, right? Like I've got a lot of buddies who guys I went to school with who they go to work from 8:30 to 5 every day to check the box to get to the weekend. Like that's what they're doing. They're going to work to get to the weekend to be able to finance whatever they're doing on that weekend or whatever they're doing with their family. I go to work every day because like I love what I do. Like this is a great job. I get to cover the biggest stories in the world. I get to cover the most important people in the world, and I get to be in the front seat for history every single day. So the pace and the tempo is insane. I think my wife would really prefer I put my phone away more often than I do, and then I wouldn't work as many weekends, and I wouldn't be working until 10:30 or 11 p.m. most nights. But she also knows and is cool enough to get that like this is great. Like as I always tell people, like, oh man, how are you dealing with the pace of this? Like it's better than having a real job, right? Like I don't go to work every day. I go to like do cool stuff every day. So I don't. It's kind of like an idealistic view of things, but seriously, like there are some pretty terrible jobs out there. Journalism is not one of them.
You kind of talked about a lot of things about the pace of it right now. You might have to cover a tweet in the morning. There's just a lot going on involving politics and reporting on it, and it kind of feels like a culmination in some ways where news was kind of going towards this tabloid thing anyways, but then social media came along, and then Trump came along, and now you're at a point where major news organizations are covering, a porn star who said she's had relations with the president. How do you, I guess on an individual basis or with your editors, decide what's important to cover on a day-to-day basis? Because there is so much that's going on, conspiracy theories, who's doing what, and you don't want to fall into the trap of, it's not a royal family, so how much do you cover the family? So I guess in a long way of asking this is how do you decide what's important?
I mean, look, it's a huge team effort, and we're lucky, from the top down. We've got a lot of people with legit journalistic chops that are going through each day and kind of deciding like these are the stories that matter, these are the stories that we're supposed to focus on. But I'm also lucky in the sense that there's a lot of trust shown in our reporters and correspondents. Like I can go to our folks and be like, this is a story, this is what we need to be covering, and our folks 9 out of 10 times will say we completely agree, like run with that. And that's lucky, and I don't think that's the case in every news organization. I think there's a lot of news organizations that are much more top down than we are. But in terms of what we cover, like, look, it's wild right now, right? And I think the danger right now is twofold. One, that there's so much stuff out there that you don't focus on the things that actually matter. You're so focused on the tweet or the Facebook post or the conspiracy theory that you're not focused on, the healthcare bill that impacts millions of people or the immigration proposal that will totally shift legal immigration in the country for the next 50 years. Instead, you're just focused on the shiny objects. And I think so there's a danger in that. And I also think that there's a danger in that so much stuff is moving at once that nobody actually understands what's happening at all, right? Like I talk to, and this might be the case for you guys, but I talk to you, probably not, but to some degree, folks that aren't in the news business. Like, dude, they couldn't tell you what happened 2 days ago, 3 days ago. They've stopped caring. They've given up on the fact. Like they pay attention on the periphery. They might read the newspaper and watch cable every once in a while, but for the most part, they're just tuned out, right? We're so into each like minuscule thing that's happening over the course of a 24-hour period that the average human being who has a job and a family, like they just can't keep up with it. And I don't think they want to. And frankly, it's probably not healthy for them to. And I think that makes it more incumbent upon us that like when we're going to hit a story, when we're going to attack a story, like make sure you take the time to like to give people a full look at what it actually means, right? As opposed to like, here's 90 seconds on this, here's 90 seconds on this, here's 90 seconds on this. Like really give them what's actually happening. And I think it's difficult. You make the point about kind of the media landscape right now. The incentives are skewed to the direction of fast, shiny, clickable, and move on to the next thing. And I think that there's a constant kind of tension within organizations. I'm not speaking for CNN. I think just in general of like, how do you do both, right? Like, how do you give people what they want and make sure that when they're on social or when they're seeing links that they want to click on it, but also make sure that when they do click on the story, it's not just 100 words and a GIF. Or, sorry, GIF. What are we? Are we a GIF or GIF people here?
We're GIF people.
All right, good. Hard G. But like that it's a fully fleshed out story with real reporting and stuff like that. Like I think that's the important thing right now.
For covering the election, you said you had a lot of time with Trump, Christie, and Kasich. Did you see this storm coming of this media distrust? Because I know during the campaign, Trump even then was preaching how the media was not giving real news and untrustworthy. So what was it like, I guess, covering a election when your job is being attacked by one of the candidates who is extremely popular among the people that you're supposed to be serving?
Yeah, so just imagine standing on a platform, like in an arena, right? Like The Shot or something like that. You're standing on a platform, and the guy on stage has whipped the entire 10,000, 15,000 person crowd into an absolute frenzy, and then is pointing at you, talking about how terrible you are. Not all of us, like you personally, shouting out you by name. Like that's different, you know. Like I didn't sign up for that. It was a little bit bizarre, you know. Going from John Kasich's campaign to that was a little bit different. Look, it's what he does. It's a tool for the president, and it was a tool for the candidate. And I think to some degree, those of us who cover the campaign understand it a little bit better, and maybe don't take it as personally as folks who weren't there and didn't deal with it. Was it unsettling? Absolutely. But the thing I try and convince people of when they ask is, before rallies, we would all go out in the crowd. Obviously, you're a reporter, and you go talk to people wherever we were, whether it was down in Wilmington, Ohio, or whether we were down in North Carolina, like wherever you were. And you would talk to the individuals, the same individuals who 30 minutes later would be totally whipped up in a frenzy and flipping you off and threatening you. And one-to-one, person-to-person, A, they were great. B, they were informed and actually had ideas and actually thought were walking through what they appreciated about the president or the then candidate, what policy stuff that they really cared about. There's this whole trope that everybody was an idiot and they didn't understand. That's garbage. That's absolutely not true. But I also think the other thing that was important is when you spoke to them person to person, there was a new appreciation for oh, you guys aren't all demons, who were sent here to by the liberal elite to off all of us or, allow the liberal elite to take it over. And so I was always struck by when you talk to Trump supporters person to person, again, a lot of my buddies from home were big Trump supporters, is that they realized that you weren't so bad. And I think for some of my colleagues, maybe particularly those who didn't come from Ohio or kind of were raised in the East Coast, they realized that the Trump supporters weren't so bad either, right? That it was just a matter of people needing to talk to one another, which I found more valuable maybe than anything else, kind of moving the caricature aside and actually talking to people one-on-one. I still have emails from people that I would meet at rallies who would afterwards either direct message me or email me and be like, hey, it was so cool to meet you. I didn't understand that you weren't all terrible people. Just a weird email to send someone. But it was cool. And it was you recognize that that's actually part of what we're supposed to be doing, is talking to people one-to-one, because that can have an impact.
You talked a little bit about how nuts and bolts stay the same even in this dynamic. The nuts and bolts of journalism is sourcing, and anonymous sources have come under a lot of, I get criticism, and just a lot of, they're being used a lot with this administration. From a student journalist perspective, that's not even something we're allowed to use. They are, our advisors over here would just, nix that off the bat. Yep. So I'm just kind of wondering, from someone who's out in the field right now, what your thoughts are on anonymous sourcing, and if it is getting used too much, how important it is, and your stance.
Look, it should be a last resort. Right. Before I worked at CNN, I worked at Bloomberg News, which had very, very strict sourcing standards. You could never quote somebody on background, so you can never quote somebody anonymously, right? Because if you're going to give them the platform to kind of lob a bomb at someone or to attack someone, then darn it, they should put their name on it. I think that's a great policy. I think you should use anonymous sources as a last resort on a story where it's extremely important. Is that the way things are currently operating? No. Absolutely not. And I think that is a dynamic that I wish would shift the other way, but it's almost like an arms race, right? I'm not going to kind of pull back my arms if you're not. And if that's the only way people are operating right now, there's such a paradigm shift to the fact that, like, I cover Capitol Hill, everyone talks on background. Like, very few people, except for the lawmakers, talk on the record. I have a lot of lawmakers that talk to me only on background, and they give you great information and information that's actionable. But I think the danger with anonymous sourcing, and the reason why the media has opened themselves up to a lot of criticism from the Trump administration, from people, is you got to be rock solid on it. Just because it's anonymous and just because somebody says something that's like really hilarious, or it's a really great quote, or it seems totally wild, doesn't mean you should put it in a story. Right? Like the sourcing, if you're going to go with an anonymous source, you better have 3 or 4 of them that lock in what it actually is, as opposed to just one guy said this one thing happened at a meeting, and you've talked to 4 people who are on the record telling you it didn't happen. Like, yeah, they could be lying to you, but like on the record should take precedent over on background. So I think we hurt ourselves with the amount of background sourcing that we use. I think if you can avoid it at all costs, do it. I think one kind of negative thing that's happened a lot is people want things on background because they think it makes the story sexier, right? Like, sources tell me X, when like they could have gotten the same thing on the record. It doesn't make the story any less good or any less valuable or any less impactful. So you should always strive for that. Like, I think it's dope that like your advisors don't let you do it. It can make it like more difficult, no question. At Bloomberg, it was more difficult sometimes to get stories out, particularly on Capitol Hill and background stuff. But I think it's a better way to learn the process. I think we are far too reliant on it right now, and I think that opens us up to, as we were talking about earlier, to get hit. Because when it's anonymous and everybody can just deny and lie, when it's on the record, then you're dead to rights. So I wish the pendulum would swing a little bit the other way. But at this point in time, it kind of is what it is. You just got to be so careful. Especially, just one quick thing. Like, this administration deliberately puts out stuff that's wrong on background to see who will print it. I haven't had it happen to me. I know it's happened to other people. And so, like, that's what you're playing with right now. If their name's not attached to it, then they're not going to get in trouble when you put out a story that's wrong, because they're just trying to see how dumb you're going to be and put it out, right? So, like, if you're going to go anonymous with stuff, you better have 4 or 5 people backing it up, or else you're just asking for it.
Different type of questioning, I guess. We are a student journalism podcast, and we do have a lot of students in our program that listen to this. So what type of tips would you give to a student to get into the place where you are now? Because before, you were telling the story in our class, you really just grinded your way to the top, it seemed like, just working all the jobs you could get, reaching out, just you even used the word begging. I begged for a job from all these places on the Hill. So what tips would you give to a young journalist trying to get to that same position?
Yeah, I'd quibble with the idea that I'm at the top, but I'm gainfully employed as a journalist. So that's a pretty sick position to be in. Look, a couple of things that I was always struck by. One is don't hesitate to reach out to people. Right? Like, I was stunned. My graduate thesis was on embedded reporters in Iraq and the effect that it had on them psychologically. And I reached out to probably 60 reporters to do my thesis, and 60 reporters who embedded. Probably heard back from like 45 of them. And while it was for my project, I also stayed in touch with a lot of them. And they were all, I was struck by how people who really care about journalism and really care about the field are like so stoked to help younger folks that want to get in it too, right? Like, if you're passionate about it, you'd be stunned that like your favorite reporter at the New York Times, your favorite reporter at the Washington Post will probably return your email when you email with them. And so it ended up to a point where like I ended up on Air Force One, sitting in Air Force One with 4 other reporters that had responded to me for my graduate thesis, all of whom had been very helpful to me when I'd asked them for advice coming up. So I think that, like, my number one thing is, like, if there's reporters that you like or writers that you like or broadcast journalists that you respect, it's not hard to find their emails. Most of our emails are on our social media accounts. Like, shoot them a note. Not everyone's going to get back to you, but a lot of them will. And they're not going to give you a job, and they're not going to give you an internship right off the bat, but there'll be resources for you. And you never know when those people are going to end up being helpful in the end, right? So that's always the one thing. Like, if you love Peter Baker at the New York Times, send him an email. Like, he gets a ton of emails. He might not get back to you right away, but he probably will at some point. He got back to me. And so that's always super helpful, because people who love journalism and love what we do for a living always are looking for kind of the next group coming up to try and help them and mentor them and keep them under their wing. So I think that's super important. The other thing is just kind of basic, like, just bust your ass, right? Sorry, I don't want to
No,
swear
you're
on
good.
your show.
You're good.
I'm sure this is a very uptight podcast. No, like there's no real secret to it. Work long hours, meet as many people as you can, take as many people out to coffee as you can, keep your head down and grind. It seems kind of cliche, but that's what it is. There's a lot of people in this industry that think that they're supposed to be stars. Those people generally don't make it, or they get weeded out pretty early. There's a lot of people in this industry who don't want to put the work in, who just want to do cable news hits and don't want to do the actual reporting. More often than not, those people get weeded out and don't actually make it. It's the people that, despite what you think because of the 24/7 news cycle and how everything's so fast and social media driven and everything like that, real reporting still wins the day. The people who CNN is hiring right now, like look across our correspondents, almost all of them used to be print guys who have reporting chops, who broke a ton of news on the print side of things. And that's the direction. You look at MSNBC, it's the same exact thing. Print guys who broke news, print guys who have a history of real reporting. Real reporting still wins the day, despite kind of what everybody thinks about the current society. And all that does is incentivize, like, when you're 22, 23, when you're in an internship, when you're doing cops in courts, when you're overnight listening to the police scanner, like, work and get those clips and get those people to respect you, because those bosses are going to recommend you to the next guy, are going to recommend you to the next guy, and that work will eventually rise to the top, I think. But who knows? I'm just trying to stay employed over here, guys.
Thanks for joining us on the Student Slant. Join us next week for more student perspective.